Good evening, everybody. It's your favorite aspiring revolutionary here, a wandering author, reminding you that we are all the authors of our own lives. As always, my message remains the same. Spend less, save more, earn your freedom with frugality. And today we're going to begin a new series, one on the great men and women of history. And the first person of interest that we will cover is going to be Solon, the lawmaker. He has been called the father of democracy. He came to prominence during a hectic time period in ancient Athens. He helped to reestablish democratic order, and he's well known for forgiving debts during his lifetime. So let's go ahead and begin here. At a time when Athens was on the brink of a nasty civil war, a great lawmaker saved the day. His name was Solon, and this was his story. Although he was merely a member of the middle class, he belonged to a notable family, a descendant of Cogius. His mother was a cousin to the future tyrant Pisistratus' mother. Some of these names are pretty tough. Athens' savior and this tyrant in the making were close friends during their youth, and their fondness for one another would never totally disappear. Solon spent his inheritance on charity, making many friends in the city on the way. However, he felt ashamed about asking for help because his family had always helped others. I think a lot of us can relate to that. So when he was a young man, he embarked in commerce, though some whisper that his travels were for experience and learning. His love for wisdom fueled his spirit, and he did not admire wealth, leaving us a poem to this effect. And I quote, "Two men are alike, wealthy of whom one much silver hath, and gold, and wide domains of wheat-bearing soil, horses and mules, while to the other only enough belongs to give him comfort of food and clothes and shoes, enjoyment of child and blooming wife. When these two come, and only years commensurate therewith are his." Yet another lyric of his shows a little more nuance. And I quote, "Wealth I desire to have, but wrongfully to get it I do not wish. Justice, even if slow, is sure." He knew that the great statesman should not focus too much on wealth nor despise it. In those days, work was seen as honorable, and even merchants were held in high esteem. Even though Solon led a mercantile existence, we can see that he considered himself among the poor from the following verses. And I quote, "For often evil men are rich, and good men poor, but we will not exchange with them our virtue for their wealth, since one abides always, while riches change their owners every day." Solon's poetry was nothing more than a pastime in the beginning. It was not until later that he began weaving philosophic maxims and political teachings into his verses. He would justify his acts as a politician using poems, which he left behind for us to enjoy. And these poems are actually one of the primary ways that we know of him. Solon was considered one of the 7 wise men back in his day, not for his philosophy, but rather his politics. Particularly, we hear of an exchange between him and Anacharsis. When Anacharsis arrived at his home one day, upon his arrival, Solon commented, saying that it was best to make friends at home. Anacharsis impressed Solon with his wit, but laughed when he saw the laws he was writing for Athens. He mocked his attempt to check the injustice and rapacity of the citizens with written laws, comparing them to spiders' webs. And I quote, "They would hold the weak and delicate who might be caught in their meshes, but would be torn in pieces by the rich and powerful." Commenting kind of on some stuff similar to today. We have all of these super wealthy people that write laws that trap and ensnare the poor and afflicted among us, yet they only get a slap on the wrist fine when they break laws themselves. So it doesn't look like things have changed much in that regard. Solon responded that men keep their agreements with each other when neither party profits by the breaking of them. So laws should be mutually beneficial. Solon's laws were written in a way to make it clear that practicing justice was better than law-breaking. Later, after attending an assembly session, Anacharsis mentioned that he was amazed to find that among the Greeks the wise men pleaded causes, but the fools decided them. When visiting Thales of Miletus, Solon exclaimed with astonishment that he was wholly indifferent to marriage and the getting of children. I'm kind of in the same boat, to be honest. However, Thales did not answer or I think some people would pronounce it Thales. You can leave something in the comments if I'm getting it wrong. Did not answer him at first, and he orchestrated a prank to illustrate a point. He had a citizen claim that he carried news from Athens. When Solon questioned the Athenian about what news there was, he responded, "None other than the funeral of a young man who was followed to the grave by the whole city. For he was the son, as I was told, of an honored citizen, who excelled all others in virtue. He was not at the funeral of his son. They told me that he had been traveling abroad for a long time." Solon asked him for the name of the lad, but the man replied that he did not know, amplifying Solon's fears. So he told the man his name, and asked if it was his boy who had perished. When the man told him it was, Solon cried out in anguish, until Thales grabbed his hand and told him that this was why he never got married or had children, and not to be dismayed because the story was a lie told by a prankster. That's a pretty sad prank. On another occasion, Solon became the general of a war against Salamis. Although the Athenians were too fearful to repeal the law that forbade a war against such a foe, Solon's poetry changed their minds, and they repealed the law with haste. When he sailed to Cape Callias, again, some of these Greek words are, it's not my native tongue, with Pisistratus, they discovered the city's women there performing a sacrifice to Demeter. Therefore he sent a man disguised as a deserter to Salamis and told them if they wished to capture the principal women of Athens, they should rush to Callias. The Megarians followed and put some men in the ship, and when Solon saw them, he ordered the women to swap places with the beardless men. The men who wore female clothing and concealed hidden daggers. Solon directed them to distract the Megarians until they had captured the vessel. Not one man escaped unscathed, and the Athenians set sail and captured the island. As a result of these events, Solon's fame burned brighter than ever, having helped the Athenians triumph over the Megarians. He was even more celebrated for convincing the Amphictyons to undertake the war, although he was not a general in this particular conflict. An archon from Megacles once persuaded men who were held to be polluted to come and stand trial. When a golden thread broke, the archons attacked the men, and for that reason the archons were hated by the people. There was a deep divide between the survivors from Solon and the descendants of Megacles, and Solon put himself between the two parties and convinced them to hold a trial. The family of Megacles was found guilty, and those who were still alive were banished. During this affair, the Megarians renewed the assault on Salamis, driving out the inhabitants from Athens. It was under these circumstances that the Athenians summoned Epimenides of Phaestus, one of the 7 wise men. Upon arriving in Athens, he befriended Solon and paved the way for his legislation. However, the Athenians, seeing the Solonian disturbance had ended, immediately refreshed old disputes over their city's form of government. The city divided into 3 major factions. The hillmen wanted an extreme democracy. These were the guys who lived up on top of the hill. The plain men, an extreme oligarchy. And then the shoremen formed a third party, favoring a mixed form of government, and they prevented either of the other parties from gaining power. By this time, a massive gulf had developed between the rich and the poor, threatening the city's very stability. Talk was that the only solution for this disordered state of affairs was to establish a tyranny. And now remember, back in the ancient Greek times, a tyrant was not what we think of them as today. He was simply a man that was given supreme power. It didn't necessarily mean that he was dictatorial. In many cases, their tyrants would actually step down once whatever crisis they were facing had been solved. So, all the common people were in debt to the rich. And this is where Solon comes up with his famous unburdening, or what was it? Yeah, the shaking off of burdens, where he basically cancels all the debts for the common folk. Most Athenians toiled on land that belonged to the wealthy and pledged 1/6 of their produce, earning them the name of hectemoroi. Many of them had borrowed money by pledging their own bodies, so if they fell behind on payments, they could be sold into slavery. Some were even sold to foreign countries and shipped away from home. So people were, you know how you get, like if you get a car loan, the car is collateral and they can repossess the car. Think about this. It's like that, but instead of repossessing your car, they can repossess you. The cruelty of the moneylenders forced many to sell their own children. However, the strongest among them banded together to choose a trustworthy leader and stopped submitting to these wrongs. They wished to divide the land anew and establish an entirely new form of government. The wisest of the Athenians set their sights upon Solon. He was not responsible for the wrongs of the time, but also was not a member of the poor. He kind of existed in the upper middle class. To the poor, Solon promised the distribution of desirable lands, and to the rich, the validation of securities. Solon's poetry betrays his reluctance to enter public life, as he feared one side's greed and the other's pride. When he entered office, the rich accepted him, for he was well-to-do, and the poor loved his honesty. Before his election, he stated equality bred no war, and the people loved him. Both sides had high hopes, and they suggested a tyranny to Solon. Everyone seemed to be pushing for him to seize the government alone. Even his family and close friends were eager to see him assume absolute power, but he refrained. How many of us could say that we would do the same? He told his friends that a tyranny may be a lovely place, but there was no way down from it. Many mocked his rejection of power, but history has been kind to his image. However, the Athenians, seeing the Solonian disturbance had ended, immediately refreshed old disputes over their city's form of government. The city divided into three major factions. The hillmen wanted an extreme democracy. These were the guys who lived up on top of the hill. The plain men, an extreme oligarchy. And then the shoremen formed a third party, favoring a mixed form of government, and they prevented either of the other parties from gaining power. By this time, a massive gulf had developed between the rich and the poor, threatening the city's very stability. Talk was that the only solution for this disordered state of affairs was to establish a tyranny. And now remember, back in the ancient Greek times, a tyrant was not what we think of them as today. He was simply a man that was given supreme power. It didn't necessarily mean that he was dictatorial. In many cases, their tyrants would actually step down once whatever crisis they were facing had been solved. So, all the common people were in debt to the rich. And this is where Solon comes up with his famous unburdening, or what was it? Yeah, the shaking off of burdens, where he basically cancels all the debts for the common folk. Most Athenians toiled on land that belonged to the wealthy and pledged 1/6 of their produce, earning them the name of hectemoroi. Many of them had borrowed money by pledging their own bodies, so if they fell behind on payments, they could be sold into slavery. Some were even sold to foreign countries and shipped away from home. So people were, you know how you get, like if you get a car loan, the car is collateral and they can repossess the car. Think about this. It's like that, but instead of repossessing your car, they can repossess you. The cruelty of the moneylenders forced many to sell their own children. However, the strongest among them banded together to choose a trustworthy leader and stopped submitting to these wrongs. They wished to divide the land anew and establish an entirely new form of government. The wisest of the Athenians set their sights upon Solon. He was not responsible for the wrongs of the time, but also was not a member of the poor. He kind of existed in the upper middle class. To the poor, Solon promised the distribution of desirable lands, and to the rich, the validation of securities. Solon's poetry betrays his reluctance to enter public life, as he feared one side's greed and the other's pride. When he entered office, the rich accepted him, for he was well-to-do, and the poor loved his honesty. Before his election, he stated equality bred no war, and the people loved him. Both sides had high hopes, and they suggested a tyranny to Solon. Everyone seemed to be pushing for him to seize the government alone. Even his family and close friends were eager to see him assume absolute power, but he refrained. How many of us could say that we would do the same? He told his friends that a tyranny may be a lovely place, but there was no way down from it. Many mocked his rejection of power, but history has been kind to his image. Despite rejecting absolute power, Solon administered the state with robust spirit. Where things worked well, he left them alone, but he also avoided giving concessions to the rich. Solon canceled all debts, calling the policy disburdenment. In addition, he forbid lending money against the person of a borrower, so he made it impossible to become a slave due to debt. He even brought back many of those who had been sold abroad, recalling those who had been sold into slavery already. Unfortunately, Solon had told 3 friends, Conon, Cleinias, and Hipponicus, that he was planning to cancel all debts, so they purchased large estates in anticipation of the cancellation, taking advantage of his trust. Once the debts were canceled, the 3 friends enjoyed their estates without repaying their creditors. This act brought great shame to Solon, as if he had been in league with these fraudsters. However, Solon sacrificed 5 talents, which was a large sum of money back then, and some writers say it may have been as many as 15 of them. Also, Solon was among the first to relinquish debts in accordance with the law, so he forgave his debtors before anybody else. Forever after this event, the 3 friends were called Chercopidae, or debt cutters. Another unfortunate reality was that both parties were vexed at his reforms. The wealthy were upset because he took away their debt-backed securities, and the poor had wanted him to redistribute the land. The poor had wanted him to do as Lycurgus had done for the Spartans. Lycurgus was first in descent from Heracles, and had the authority, power, and friends to make everyone equals in Sparta. On the other hand, Solon was a man of the people, and he obtained his ends with persuasion rather than force. Because we do need to remember, in Sparta they were basically proto-communist. Even though he did not act short of his power, he offended the greater portion of the city. Nevertheless, the people quickly saw the advantage of his measure and offered a public sacrifice in his honor, which they called disburdenment. Thus they appointed Solon to reform their constitution, removing all restrictions from his power. Solon was given full reign over the laws, magistracies, which were political offices, assemblies, law courts, and councils. He was charged with setting property qualifications and meeting times for these institutions. His first act was to overturn the laws of Draco, which is where we get the term draconian from, because he was so strict. The inspiration for the word draconian. The only laws of Draco left after this were the ones concerning homicide. Draco's laws had originally assigned the death penalty even for the crime of idleness, or just sitting around not doing anything. Supposedly, Draco said that he made the penalty death for almost all offenses because he felt the lesser transgressions deserved it, and he could find no stiffer penalty for the greater ones. Pretty hardcore. Next, Solon wanted to give the commoners a share in the government, but also to keep most of the magistracies in the hands of the well-to-do. For that reason, he conducted property appraisals for all the citizens. In the first class, he placed anyone who saw a yearly increase of 500 measures. After the 500 measure men, he ranked the equites, or those who could afford to keep a horse. The third class were those with an annual increase of 200 measures, or the zeugatai. The final class was that of the laborers, who could not hold office but could take part in the assembly or as jurors. Since most legal cases would fall in the jurors' hands, this last act turned out to be of significant importance. Even if a case had been assigned to the magistracies for a decision, you could still appeal it before the popular courts. Some say that Solon's laws were deliberately worded to enhance the popular court's powers. Anyone who had a dispute with the law would ask the jurors to decide it, so the people in a way became masters of the law. Solon wrote the following poem to summarize what he had done. For to the common people I gave so much power as is sufficient, neither robbing them of dignity, nor giving them too much, and those who had power and were marvelously rich, even for these I contrived that they suffered no harm. I stood with a mighty shield in front of both these classes, and suffered neither of them to prevail unjustly. Solon also made it possible for anyone to intersuit if they had suffered a wrong. If your neighbor had been assaulted, you could open a case for him. When someone asked Solon what city was best to live in, he replied, "That city in which those who are not wronged, no less than those who are wronged, exert themselves to punish the wrongdoers." As a member of the Areopagus Council, Solon decided to create another council of 400 men, with 100 for each of the 4 tribes. This council would deliberate on which measures would be brought before the people. One of his more obscure laws was that a man should lose his franchise, or otherwise known as the right to vote, if he refused to take sides in a time of faction. Another crazy one was the law requiring female heiresses to be married to her husband's next of kin to produce a male heir. So that could be like the husband's brother if he died. People praising his law forbade speaking ill of the dead or the living, and his law regarding wills. Thanks to his legislation, men could bequeath his property to whomever he pleased. Seeing his country swell up with people from all over, that most of the country was unfruitful, and that merchants would not import goods without something to exchange, he enacted a law that any son who was not taught a trade did not have to support their father. Solon saw that the land of Attica was barely enough for subsistence, and gave dignity to all the trades. He also asked the Areopagus Council to investigate every man's livelihood, and to chastise those without an occupation. #jobs. However, he also made some absurd laws regarding women, such as the one permitting the killing of adulterers caught in the act. In addition, he outlawed the selling of a daughter or sister unless she was not a virgin. So if you had gotten busy, you could be sold by your parents. Quite different than today. Since the countryside was not well supplied with water, Solon built public wells for anyone to use if they lived within 4 furlongs. If you lived further away, he made it legal to search for water on your neighbor's land. Tree planting was also regulated under Solon's administration, and you could not plant anything within 5 feet of a neighbor's tree or a neighbor's field, unless it was a fig tree or an olive tree, which were exceptions. And then it had to be planted 9 feet away. Since these trees had long-reaching roots, the extra distance kept them from injuring nearby saplings or stealing their nourishment. And then, quote, of the products of the soil, he allowed oil only to be sold abroad, but forbade the exportation of others, end quote. When this law was put into effect, you would be called a sycophant or fig shower if you pointed out a neighbor who was exporting. Only people who were exiled from their homes or people who brought their families to ply a trade could become immigrants. So he had some kind of immigration laws, so basically he only allowed skilled immigrants. Plutarch says his laws were meant to stay in place for 100 years, and they were kept on massive wooden tablets called axons. The council jointly ratified Solon's laws, and the guardians of the statute swore a separate oath. He fixed the cycle of the month to the day that the moon overtook the sun. As soon as the ink dried on the laws, people started pouring into Solon's chamber with complaints and suggestions. Some of them simply wanted him to teach and instruct them on each and every item. When he saw that it would be impossible to please them all, he purchased a vessel and obtained a 10-year leave of absence from the Athenians. His hopes were that they would grow accustomed to his laws in that time. At first, he ventured to Egypt and spent time with Xenophus of Heliopolis and Soncus of Sais, 2 learned priests. Plato reported that Solon learned of Atlantis and brought it back to Greece from there. After his Egyptian foray, he set sail for Cyprus, where he was said to have persuaded a prince to relocate the city to make it more spacious. Solon stayed with Philocyprus and aided in the city's relocation, and this new city was named solely in his honor. It is said that when Solon visited Sardis at the invitation of Croesus, that he had a similar experience to an inland man going to visit the sea. Since an inland man mistakes each new river as the sea, so Solon was through wave after wave of retainers until he finally arrived at Croesus, who was decked out with marvelous and extravagant gems, jewelry, and gold. However, Solon expressed no astonishment at the extravagant display, and he did not heap praise upon Croesus as he expected. Instead, he made it clear that he detested such vulgar displays. The king ordered his vaults be opened so that Solon could witness his treasure chambers. Solon's character had already spoken volumes, but after seeing the riches held inside, Croesus asked him if he had ever known a happier man. Solon replied that his friend Tellus, a fellow citizen, had been happier. Tellus had been an honest man, left behind reputable sons, and died on the battlefield with glory. Immediately Croesus judged Solon as strange, for he did not use gold and silver as his measure of happiness, instead admiring the life and death of an ordinary private man more than the displays of power and wealth. Croesus asked him if he knew any men more fortunate than he, and Solon remarked that Cleobus and Beto had been more fortunate. These men had surpassed all others in brotherly love and dutiful affection toward their mother. Once their mother's carriage had broken, so Cleobus and Beto hoisted the yoke upon their shoulders and carried it the rest of the way to the temple of Hera, where they were happily greeted by their countrymen. After sacrifice and eating, the brothers laid to rest, never rising again, with such a fresh honor heaped upon them. At this Croesus exclaimed, "Dost thou not count us among happy men at all?" Solon did not wish to anger him further, but also did not want to flatter him, so he replied, quote, "O king of Lydia, as the deity has given us Greeks all other blessings in moderation, so our moderation gives us a kind of wisdom which is timid in all likelihood and fit for common people, not one which is kingly and splendid." End quote. This wisdom, such as it is, observing that human life is subject to all manners of ups and downs, forbids us to be pumped up by the good things we have, or to admire a man's kindness when there is still time for change. For the future is changing and uncertain, but when the deity bestows prosperity on a man at the end, that is a man we consider happy. To claim someone as happy while he is still living would be like proclaiming an athlete was victorious before the end of a race. It just so happened that Aesop, the writer of fables, had been summoned to Sardis by Croesus. He was dismayed at the treatment Solon had received, and told him, "Solon, our conversations with kings should be as rare or as pleasant as possible." Solon remarked, "No, indeed, but either as rare or as beneficial as possible." For a time, Croesus held Solon in contempt, until he was defeated by the Persians, in battle, lost a city, and was abducted and condemned to be burned alive. When he was thrown onto the pyre, in view of all the Persians and even Cyrus himself, he cried out with all his might, "O Solon!" Upon hearing this exclamation, an astonished Cyrus sent his men to ask what man or god this Solon was. Without concealing anything, Croesus told the mighty Persian king, "This man was one of the sages of Greece, and I sent for him not with any desire to hear or learn the things of which I stood in need, but in order that he might behold and bear testimony to the happiness I then enjoyed, the loss of which I now see to be a greater evil than its possession was a good. Solon told me to look at the end of my life and not be proud and arrogant." Cyrus saw the truth of this story in the man in front of him, and since he was a wiser king, he let Croesus go. Thus Solon is said to have saved one king and instructed another with a single saying. Now while Solon was away, the Athenian people had divided into factions. Lycurgus led the plain men, Megacles headed the shore men, and Pisistratus was at the head of the hill men. The hillmen were composed of a multitude of the lower classes, who were bitter enemies of the rich. Consequently, despite observing Solon's laws, the whole of Athens anticipated a revolution, and desired a new form of government. However, none of the factions desired equality, but instead they each wanted to be empowered by the change and to establish mastery over their opponents. Solon returned to a disunited Athens, and, owing to his age, he no longer had the strength of presence that he once enjoyed in public speaking. He still met with the leaders of all the factions in an attempt to reconcile and harmonize them. Pisistratus appeared to pay him heed more than the rest, thanks to his agreeable demeanor. He said that he was ready to help the poor, and his expectations seemed quite reasonable. Even if he lacked virtues by nature, Pisistratus was a master of imitation, so people liked him more than those with true virtue. A real politician, like we might say today. The people mistook him for a cautious, order-loving man who valued equality above all else, and would take offense if anyone disturbed the existing order. His deception fooled most people, but Solon was the first to detest his real character, and understand his secret designs. Nevertheless, Solon did not treat him as if he were an enemy. He did his best to soften and mold him via instruction alone. He actually told him and the people that if his desire for preeminence could be banished from his soul, and his eager passion for tyranny cured, no other man would be more naturally disposed to virtue or a better citizen. Around this time, Thespis the playwright was beginning to develop the tragedy. and his attempts began to attract attention, thanks to its novelty. It's hard to imagine a time before even something as simple as a tragedy was invented. As Solon was naturally fond of anything new, and more predisposed than ever in his old age to enjoy amusement, he went to watch Thespis act in a play. After the play ended, Solon accosted Thespis, asking him if he was not ashamed to tell such lies before the people. Thespis replied that it was harmless, but Solon smacked the ground with his cane and told him that if we gave praise to such plays, we should soon find it in contracts. Then Pisistratus inflicted a wound upon himself and rode a chariot into the marketplace, telling the citizens that his enemies had tried to end his life over political opinions. Many of the people greeted the charge with angry cries, but Solon accused him of playing the Homeric Odysseus badly. For when he disfigured himself, it was to deceive his enemies, but thou doest it to mislead thy fellow citizens. Following his theatrical display, Pisistratus had the people willing to fight for him, and they held a general assembly of the people. Ariston mentioned that Pisistratus be given a bodyguard of 50 club-bearers. Solon formally opposed it, and his poem says the rest. Begin quote. Ye have regard indeed to the speech and words of a wily man, yet every one of you walks with the steps of a fox, and in you all dwells an empty mind. End quote. However, his words fell on deaf ears, and he saw the poor clamoring to gratify Pisistratus, and the rich were shrinking away from him in fear. So Solon left the assembly, saying he was wiser than one party, and braver than the other. He was wiser than the ones who could not see that Pisistratus was aiming at a tyranny, and braver than the ones who saw it but did nothing. The people passed a decree to give Pisistratus as many club-bearers as he wished, and he paraded around with them until he finally seized the Acropolis. After this seizure, Megacles and the Alcmenidae fled, but Solon remained behind. He went to the marketplace to reason with the citizens, blaming their weakness and folly, but also encouraging them not to abandon their liberty. It was at this moment that he uttered his famous saying, that it had been easier for them to hinder the tyranny earlier while it was in preparation, but now it was a greater task to uproot and destroy it when it had already been planted and grown. It's always easier to stop tyranny when it is nascent than it is to overthrow a tyrant once he is in power. When he understood that no one had the courage to side with him, he retreated to his home and placed his arms and armor in the street, claiming, I have done all I can to help my country and its laws. From then on, Solon lived in retirement, and when his friends tried telling him to leave, he declined and continued writing poetry. Many tried warning him that the tyrant would put him to death, and when they asked him what he relied on, since he had lost all sense, he retorted, my old age. Nevertheless, once Pisistratus was master of the situation, he honored Solon and showed him kindness. He even invited him to the palace, and Solon acted as his advisor, and approved of much of his legislation. He also kept Solon's laws, and got his friends to do the same. Pisistratus was summoned to the Areopagus council after becoming a tyrant, and when he arrived, he found that the accuser was not there. Nevertheless, he passed some laws for the people, like giving a pension to injured veterans. As often how tyrants maintain their power by giving something to those at the lower end of society. Solon is said to have begun writing a tale of Atlantis, but abandoned it, fearing the task's magnitude. Plato picked up where he left off, according to legend. Unfortunately, Plato's life ended prior to finishing this magnificent work. It is said that Solon lived 2 years longer after the establishment of Pisistratus' tyranny. Supposedly, according to Aristotle, his ashes were scattered on the island of Salamis. So, we see the father of democracy's legacy actually ends in the tyranny of one Pisistratus, and not a long-lasting democratic establishment. Now, as those who have studied Athenian history know, Athens goes through many periods of tyranny and democracy over its lifetime in ancient Greece. So, Solon's laws set a precedent for future generations to follow. And we remember him today, or history remembers him today, as most commonly the father of democracy. This is a wandering author here reminding you that we all have a part to play. And my normal question, as always, applies. What are y'all doing in order to inspire, uplift, and empower your local community today? Because this world isn't changing unless we all do our part, and you can count on me to do mine daily. Till next time, I love y'all.